This video was brought to you by Incogni. With the situation in Ukraine looking increasingly precarious and a NATO-sceptic Trump administration waiting in the wings, most of Europe now agrees that it needs to take its own security more seriously. Defense budgets are going up, intra-European cooperation is increasing, and in an interview with the FT last week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen even said that she wanted to create the post of Defense Commissioner. In fact, some other European politicians have gone further, resurrecting the controversial idea of a European Union army to protect the continent. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of this idea, why there are renewed calls for one, and whether it could actually happen. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, the first thing to say is that while it's clearly making a resurgence, the idea of an EU army isn't entirely new. In fact, pretty significant progress was made towards an independent EU security policy around the turn of the millennium, when French President Jacques Chirac and British Prime Minister Tony Blair signed the San Malo Declaration in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars. This declaration laid the groundwork for the development of a united European security and defence policy, which basically emphasised the need for the EU to be able to act autonomously in matters of security and defence. What followed were a series of agreements setting out a framework for defence cooperation, which aligned with NATO's policy and allowed the EU to use NATO's assets. Soon, the EU had embarked on its first peacekeeping mission in North Macedonia in 2003, and in the following years deployed European troops in multiple peacekeeping civilian missions around the world, under the ESDP. But progress towards a true European army halted and then regressed in the mid-2000s, for two reasons. Firstly, in 2004, 10 new countries joined the EU, 7 of which were formerly part of the Eastern Bloc, and 3 of which were ex-Soviet countries. In part because these countries were mainly worried about Russia's neo-imperial ambitions, they overwhelmingly preferred NATO and the US to the idea of an EU army, an intra-European division that remains today. Secondly, the Iraq War in 2003 divided France and the UK. Now, there were always minor disagreements on the specifics and implementation of this new EU security policy, but the Iraq War laid bare some more fundamental strategic disagreements between the two leaders, and essentially put an end to the prospect of a European security policy fronted by the UK and France. Since then, though, the idea has sort of died for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, Iraq and then Brexit basically meant that France, which has always been the loudest advocate for a European security policy, had to rely on Germany instead of the UK for any European security policy. But this never really worked because, well, the German army just isn't strong enough. Secondly, most of Europe complacently believed that there would never be a full-scale war on the continent, which meant that there was little impetus for security reform. But thirdly, a series of crises from 2008 onwards kept the EU constantly busy with other problems, which meant that there was little political bandwidth for more speculative projects like an EU army. Today then, defence is exclusively a matter for independent states, most of whom prefer to work independently on their own defence projects, and favour their own defence production companies. But this approach overlooks Europe's collective interests. So even though the EU's combined defence spending is on par with Russia and China, the lack of streamlined or coordinated defence framework means that the EU just doesn't get as much bang for its buck. Today, however, threats from Russia in the east and a potential Trump presidency in the west mean that the idea of a European army, or at least greater cooperation on security matters, is coming back. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European leaders and citizens alike have begun calling for enhanced defence cooperation. The Dutch Defence Minister and Italy's Foreign Minister are among some European policymakers who argue that the EU needs to be a real actor on the international stage, and an EU army is a precondition for a strong EU foreign policy. Among EU citizens, 81% support a common defence and security policy, 93% believe in collective action for EU territorial defence, and 85% endorse increased EU-level defence cooperation. The EU has reacted to all of this by increasing defence spending and taking steps to boost defence cooperation, signing multiple new shared defence policies. Earlier this month, in fact, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced new plans to ensure the bloc's long-term security and guarantee against a Trump presidency, including using EU funding to subsidize defense production, encouraging joint procurement, and even appointing a dedicated defense minister. So could von der Leyen's new plan be setting a precedent for a bigger project yet to be realized? Perhaps a European army? Well, the prospect of an EU army still seems a distant reality, even though support for it has grown among citizens, especially following Russia's invasion. Yet, von der Leyen's plan, let alone the idea of an EU army, still faces a lot of obstacles. This plan would need to be approved by all member states, but as we've mentioned, unanimity when it comes to defence has always been difficult. Many European leaders are also anxious about how an EU army would interact with NATO, seen by many members as the primary security organisation for the West, and whether it might undermine or duplicate some of NATO's strategic functions. These issues explain why the EU didn't make more progress towards an independent security policy during the first Trump presidency, even though both French President Emmanuel Macron and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel actively endorsed the creation of an EU army.
Aber wir sollten, das sage ich sehr bewusst auch aus der Entwicklung der letzten Jahre, wir sollten an der Vision arbeiten, eines Tages auch eine echte europäische Armee zu schaffen. Jean-Claude Juncker?
But perhaps the main obstacle to a European army at the moment is funding. Some, like Macron and Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, have suggested that the EU should issue EU-wide bonds to fund its security policy. But this doesn't go down well with countries like the Netherlands or Germany, who are generally more wary of debt sharing. But it's hard to see how else it could be funded, given that Europe's national governments are already struggling to meet the NATO spending target of 2%, and are already heading for recession-induced austerity. All in all, it looks like there's just not enough union in the union for an EU army anytime soon. Nonetheless, we should still expect greater coordination on security and more joint procurement going forward, and it's possible that this could pave the way for some sort of load-bearing European security structure sometime in the future. Clearly then, the current state of the world is being plagued by uncertainty and risk, and while you've been watching this video about a potential EU army, your personal information may have been sold or published online without you even knowing about it. Even while recording videos, we're constantly interrupted by robocalls, and if you're wondering why you've been getting so many random numbers calling your phone, well, the answer is the malevolent workings of shady forces called data brokers. These data brokers can collect and sell your personal information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. This data can include your name and aliases, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and more. Even if you're not fussed about a phone call here or there, one day it could be a little call, but the next day a huge loan taken out in your name. In fact, that exact thing happened to me a few years ago. So if you want to protect your data, Incogni is here to help. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. Since many data brokers continue collecting your personal information even after they've removed it, Incogni also takes care that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, if you use our link in the description, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.